Who would have thought that a Druid subclass would be such a great necromancer? And you know what? Circle of the Spores is one of the most thematic subclasses ever released in 5th edition D&D, as well as being extremely mechanically powerful. It's a joy to play, so without further ado, let me tell you why you should play Circle of Spores Druid. This guide is based on my personal experiences. I will not be going over basic subclass information, y'all can probably read. I've played or DM'd for all the Druid subclasses, my opinions probably do not align with the D&D community at large. I'm going to be giving rankings for subclasses based on 5 criteria. Role-playing potential, spellcasting, wild shaping, utility, and the X factor, or something different that the subclass brings to the table that is unique from all the other subclasses. Each Druid subclass feature can gain 5 points in each category. However, the later in level a class feature is gotten, the more heavily it will be scrutinized. Since most parties never reach 10th level, abilities that come after 10th level won't be given as much weight. Alright, with that out of the way, let's begin. Let's talk about what there is to love, and boy is there a lot of it. Firstly, spores are such an awesome concept. They are thematic, and a player can picture it almost immediately. And the mechanics of them work well as well. Halo of Spores is very fun and does a lot of good damage. I think most importantly though, it gives druids something to do with their reaction, because druids have a problem where normally they don't do a lot with that reaction of theirs. You have to take feats usually, or have very specific spells in order to use that. Halo of Spores means that if you're playing Druid and are in the midline, you are generally going to be using that reaction almost every single round. Then you get access to Symbiotic Entity, and this is where I think a lot of Druid players maybe mess up a bit, because Circle of Spores is not a close combat Druid. It is for the midline, which is where a lot of other Druids make their living. But because you get that extra necrotic damage, everyone thinks, okay, I have more health, I do more damage per hit, I'm going to move up to the front. And that's really not what you should be doing to get the most out of your Circle of Spores. Because a lot of the best parts about this subclass operate off of your Symbiotic Entity. But this feature only lasts as long as you've got that temporary hit points. So stay in the midline near a frontline fighter and have them soak up the damage. When enemies come up to you, hit them with your spores, because the reason why this subclass is so mechanically interesting is you have to weigh being close enough to the fight to use your Halo of Spores while making sure you maintain your temporary hit point pool, because when they drop to 0, that Symbiotic Entity and all those other features that stack off of it don't happen anymore. It gives a lot of extra depth to the subclass. Now you can go in and you can be a better close combat fighter, but just know that some of your other subclass features will be on the fritz, because you have to have this central subclass ability going basically at all times in order to get the most out of your subclass. Next reason you want to play this subclass is it's a thematic juggernaut. You have such depth in not only the subclass idea, but all the features help to reinforce what this subclass is, from raising the dead as these fungal zombies, your Halo of Spores, how your body changes and morphs at higher levels. It's just great, and you will have a lot of role-playing potential here. And let's talk about raising the dead, because at 6th level you get what I think is the best subclass feature that you're going to get, which is Fungal Infestation. This feature is super easy to use, and usually you'll have a lot of targets with it. However, if you'll be in a campaign without many humanoids or beasts, consider talking to your DM about alternative zombies. And here's my simple recipe. Any large or smaller creature can be revived at 1 hit point. Other than that, go by the usual Fungal Infestation rules. Honestly, it works just fine. But no matter what though, Circle of Spores gives you what is essentially a simple, easy, and fun way to raise your undead. Plus you get Animate Dead from your Circle spells. And let's talk about your Circle spells, because they have really good options packed in there. Chill Touch, which is a really great damaging cantrip. Gaseous Form, Blight, Cloud Kill, all of these are, again, super thematic and useful. They are solid spells that are going to always be useful, and you can flavor them to really tie into the thematic themes of this subclass, which are perfect. And really, I think that's one of the best things about Circle of Spores. Everything ties together thematically perfectly. You know exactly what this subclass is about just by looking at its subclass features. Honestly, I wish something like Circle of Dreams or Circle of the Land took some notes out of Circle of Spores playbook. Now let's get into the concepts that make up this subclass. And firstly, Death and Decay. This subclass deals, I think, with the natural cycle of death within the natural world, which it is an aspect, and this circle is the guardian of that. They find beauty in death because death isn't an end to life, but it's a shifting, as the subclass says, into a new form, into bacteria, into fungi, into whatever you wish. And these druids help make sure that that cycle is at its healthiest and that it is vibrant and changing and flowing. So perhaps if you're playing a Circle of Spores druid, really have an in-depth idea of what your druid thinks about death in the natural cycle and how they wish to handle it. I think you can also take this druid to the disease route with spores and bacteria and spreading of disease. Because disease is obviously a part of the natural world, and I suppose that there would have to be druids that would want to protect that aspect as well. Diseases and plagues are important actually in the natural cycle of many ecosystems, so perhaps this is the druid that either stops unnecessary plagues or diseases. Perhaps there's been a battlefield massacre, and instead of having all these terrible diseases go into the countryside, they go to contain them. Or perhaps you can go the more insane evil route, and this druid is all about spreading as much disease as they can. Again, it's up to you, but it's thematically built for both options. Really though, I generally think that Spores druids focus on the darker sides of nature, the sides that the living tend to ignore and step away from, and that allows them to occupy a very interesting space, because dark doesn't mean evil. Dark means unknown and mysterious, and these are the druids that help guide the average person through those places in life. Now let's talk multi-classing, and with this multi-classing, we're going to try to take advantage of the extra necrotic damage from Symbiotic Entity, because I think with multi-classing, then your druid, your Spores druid, can become better at going into melee, but it needs some help. And if you're doing this, I would point you to this video right here where it talks about building a non-wisdom focused druid. And essentially it talks about focusing on constitution and either strength or dexterity and allowing wisdom to be a tertiary or even maybe your lowest ability score, just because there are so many druid spells that don't require a high spell save or spell attack modifier. So think about watching that video and taking some of that advice before thinking about multi-classing here. But first, of course, the multi-class that is always good for Druid, mostly except for Circle of the Land, is Barbarian. Symbiotic Entity plus Rage is great. You're getting the extra damage, the extra necrotic damage, and the Rage is going to make sure that temporary HP lasts longer. But perhaps even better than that is we're going to go Monk, because Monk with Symbiotic Entity and Unarmed Strikes can output lots of attack, which are bolstered by the Symbiotic Entity. So you're getting more use out of the extra necrotic damage because a Monk can output so many attacks. Let's just take, for example, a Spore Druid, 2nd level, combined with 2 levels of Monk. If all our attacks hit in a round, which means we're doing Flurry of Blows plus a regular attack, then we're doing 3d4 plus 3d6 plus 9 damage, an average of 27 points of damage, plus we still have a reaction available to do Halo of Spores. And if in a round you are trying to cast a spell instead, you still have a bonus action available for the dodge action, further protecting those temporary hit points that you so desperately wish to hold on to. The last multi-class potential we're going to talk about today is the Fighter, and Action Surge plus Symbiotic Entity is just a joy. I mean, Action Surge is great for any occasion, really, but Symbiotic Entity is an action to activate. So if you're not going into a battle prepared, or if you're jumped, it's going to take you a full round to get fully powered. However, with an Action Surge, you can activate your Symbiotic Entity, and then Action Surge to cast whatever spell you're hoping to cast. Second Wind here also pairs surprisingly well because you're already a more tanky druid, and with a Second Wind, this is only going to help you. And now I just want to point out something else. This isn't a multi-class, but this is a potential race. where if you're going for a Spores Druid, consider going Goliath, because the Goliath race adds a few very important factors. Firstly, it's giving you Constitution, which I think is very important for a Spores Druid, and you can obviously switch Strength to Wisdom as of Tasha's. But also, it has Stone's Endurance, and this allows you to subtract damage equal to a roll of a d12 plus your Constitution modifier, and this is any damage, so it allows you to further protect the temporary hit points that you have. Honestly, I think it's probably the best race for a Spores Druid, with an Aarakocra coming in probably a close second. Now let's move on to the flaws section of the video. And look, quite honestly, most of the things that hold Spore Druid back are balancing based. It is a super solid subclass, and while there are some things holding it back, they are for balancing, so that a Spore Druid doesn't become too powerful or overshadow other party members. Is it super powerful? Yes, of course it is. But it's not broken, it is not overpowered. I think it is one of the most perfectly balanced subclasses in all of 5th edition. With that out of the way, let me get into some minor nitpicks. Firstly, it sucks that Symbiotic Entity drops as soon as you lose your temporary hit points. It's really annoying, so I would have liked to see it where you have until maybe the end of your next turn for you to lose those abilities, because it just feels like at times you could spend your entire round starting up your Symbiotic Entity and it's gone before you reach your next turn. So DMs, at least try to be mindful if you're DMing for a Spores Druid to give them at least one turn that they can use their powers with their Symbiotic Entity. And I also think that Symbiotic Entity probably needs to be a bonus action. This is what I think Wizards of the Coast might change if they went through it again, because an action is just so slow compared to what other subclasses or classes get. I mean, hell, if Rage is a bonus action, something that's so core and central to a Barbarian, and arguably does more when you add in other subclass features, I think that it would be fair if Symbiotic Entity happened as a bonus action. One final thing, it's a tad tricky to use Spreading Spores, the 10th level ability for the Spore Druid, because there are a few factors holding it back. Firstly, you can only throw it 30 feet away from you. It only has a 10-foot cube of reach, so if you're trying to drop it into a bunch of enemies, you might only hit a few, and you also can't protect your friends, so if there are a bunch of enemies and they're grouped up with your friends, you can't drop it. Even then, at 10th level, you're only doing 2d8 necrotic damage, and if you save, the enemies take 0 damage. Which sucks because you're only doing an average of 9 points of damage, you are losing a ton of features, and you honestly might get nothing from it. It's good for holding a specific point like a doorway or something like that, but even then, that's a rare circumstance. So I wish that this feature was changed up just a little bit. Honestly, I'd like it if you could choose the creatures who you'd want to affect, therefore protecting your friends, but it's balancing. A lot of these choices are for balancing to make sure that this Druid isn't too powerful. So I'm not really upset with anything here, and I think most players really won't notice. So what are the final ratings? Well, you probably could have guessed role-playing, and that's a 20 out of 20. This is an incredibly thematic subclass that gives a lot of role-playing potential, and I really couldn't ask for more. Spellcasting is a 15 out of 20. The circle spells are powerful. You get to basically animate zombies for free without using spell slots. You have a lot of abilities that almost act as spells, but again, don't require spell slots. So this really helps your spellcasting and preserve the spell slots for spells that you need. 15 out of 20 really helps casting your spells. Wild Shape, and this might surprise you, is a 19 out of 20 because you can use your spore powers in your Wild Shape. So if you Wild Shape into a bear, that bear has a bunch of spores around them and you can still use your Halo of Spores. It is great if you are a squirrel and a creature dies next to you. Let's say another squirrel, you can reanimate it. Gives a lot of versatility in your Wild Shape. It's hilarious to me whenever a Wild Shaped Druid uses their spore abilities in their Wild Shape. And of course, you get to use your Wild Shape to fuel abilities. I think this was one of the first times in 5th edition where Wizards of the Coast made this design choice. And so even if you aren't Wild Shaping into creatures, you still get to use that Wild Shape. And so for all those reasons, easy 19 out of 20. Utility is a 9 out of 20. The circle spells help you get some use out of other features, but it's average to slightly below average utility. X Factor is a 19 out of 20. It would have been 20 out of 20, but one off for that balancing because it's not broken. It's a well-balanced subclass, and its X Factor and all its cool abilities are just that really, really cool and make it feel extremely unique. And for all those reasons, I'm giving the final grade for the Spores Druid an 82 out of 100. This is a fantastic and fun Druid subclass that I would highly recommend. If you are a thematic role-playing type player, go this subclass because it's going to give you everything you need to make a really cool character and dive into this subclass. And if you want more Druid videos, check out this one right here, and thank you for entering the dungeon.